In the summer of 2018, I found myself in the back seat of my parents' car, my husband beside me, as we made our way toward Indianapolis. The trip was supposed to be a small getaway, a chance to reconnect and enjoy each other's company. But the timing was cruel. Just a day earlier, I discovered something that left me reeling. My husband had been emotionally involved with his ex-girlfriend. The weight of that betrayal pressed down on me, thick and unrelenting, filling every silence with questions I couldn't shake. My parents sat in the front, oblivious to the silent turmoil festering in the back seat. We drove for hours, each mile a reminder of the distance between us. My husband barely spoke, his silence matching mine. I knew I couldn't sit there much longer, trapped with the aching knot in my stomach. I needed air, space, anything to escape the spiral of betrayal and anger that churned within me. When we finally stopped for a break, I excused myself, saying I needed a cigarette. They didn't question it. I slipped away, walking off without looking back. But I didn't stop at a quiet spot to smoke. Instead, I found myself heading toward a small bar nearby. I pushed open the door, hoping the buzz of people and the sting of alcohol could numb what I was feeling, even if only for a moment. Inside the dimly lit bar, I sank into a seat at the counter and ordered a drink, something strong. The first sip burned, spreading warmth that eased the sharp edge of pain, if only slightly. Drink after drink, I felt the world blur around me, the weight in my chest softening. The betrayal didn't vanish, but with each glass it grew quieter, retreating to a place where I could almost ignore it. After a while, I left the bar, my steps unsteady, the streetlights spinning in my periphery. I found myself at a nearby TGI Fridays and continued drinking there, hoping to drown the ache once and for all. Time seemed to slip by in uneven waves, each minute stretching or shrinking depending on the glass in my hand. Finally, feeling the need to breathe and gather myself, I stepped outside. The night air was cool, sharp against my flushed skin. I fumbled for a cigarette, leaning heavily against a nearby light post, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The sounds around me blurred, distant voices and traffic mixing with my own thoughts. I closed my eyes just for a moment, letting myself drift, unaware of the danger lurking nearby. The world around me spun slightly as I leaned against the light post, letting the cold night air sharpen my senses. But before I could fully gather myself, something shifted. A car pulled up beside me, its presence unsettling, though my fogged mind took a moment to process it. Suddenly, a rough hand gripped my arm, yanking me away from the light post. I stumbled, confusion and panic jolting through me, as I realized I was being pulled toward the open door of the stranger's car. I tried to resist, but my body was heavy and unresponsive. Before I knew it, I was in the car, the door closing beside me. My pulse raced, fear cutting through the fog as I looked at the man next to me, his face looking very much like that of my ex-husband. My mind was racing, with fragments of thought and fear spiraling out of control. I wasn't sure it was him, but it looked a lot like him. I tried to scream, but my voice barely sounded, trapped in the fog of confusion. Then, through the muffled haze, I heard my mother's voice, hoarse, urgent. She was outside, screaming, begging the man to let me go. She was shouting that I was her daughter, her voice piercing through the chaos. But the man didn't stop. He grabbed my arm tighter. At that moment, I knew he had no intention of letting me go. My mother's voice grew louder, her words frantic as she threatened to call the police. Her desperation finally seemed to get to him. His grip loosened, and, with one last warning look, he opened the door and pushed me out onto the sidewalk. My vision blurred as I stumbled to get up, the streetlights above casting strong shadows that made everything seem surreal. I could barely make sense of what had happened, the night's events a fractured blur. My hands trembled as I tried to focus, realizing my phone was no longer in my pocket. I looked around, my heart sinking, as I saw it discarded nearby, lying in the dirt, as though it had been tossed out intentionally. Had he tried to separate me from any chance of being found? Moments later, my husband and mother rushed toward me, their faces pale with worry, their arms pulling me into a tight embrace. The relief in their eyes was matched by the terror still clinging to my own. They helped me back to the car, each step feeling heavy, my mind struggling to process the events as the adrenaline began to wear off. I woke up the next morning in a hospital bed, my arms restrained gently to prevent any sudden movements. I could feel the ache in my limbs, bruises marking where the man had gripped me. The physical pain seemed distant, overshadowed by the numbing memory of being trapped in his car, helpless. My mind replayed the moment over and over, the lingering fear entwining with the relief of being safe. My husband was beside me, his eyes weary but filled with a quiet determination. I felt the weight of our strained relationship, but that morning there was no bitterness, no anger, only a shared relief and gratitude that I was still there, that the worst had been narrowly avoided. As we left the hospital together, I realized the experience had left a mark, something neither of us could fully forget. But it also brought us closer, a silent promise to move forward, stronger and more aware of the fragility of each moment. A reminder of how close I had come to something far danger. A reminder that in one way or another, I would carry this night with me for the rest of my life. The year I spent with Michael left scars that ran far deeper than anyone around me could have known. When I met him, he'd been charming, attentive in ways I hadn't experienced before, but it wasn't long before that facade fractured, revealing someone far more volatile. Arguments became a staple of our relationship, escalating from minor disagreements to full-blown shouting matches in which he unleashed anger that I could hardly comprehend. But beyond the shouting, it was his manipulation that twisted my sense of reality. One moment he was apologetic, and the next he wielded his apologies like weapons, using them to keep me within the tight grip of his control. It was in his darker moods, though, that his threats crept in, thinly veiled hints that he could make life unbearable if I ever thought of leaving. He would talk about consequences for walking away, and more insidiously, would reference harm to my family, reminding me that my decisions could affect them as well. His words left me paralyzed, trapped within a fragile sense of security that kept me by his side for far too long. One evening, though, something inside me shifted. After a particularly violent argument, I found myself staring at the door, feeling the weight of his threats less like barriers and more like a web I was finally prepared to break. I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I'd been pushed past any fear of what he might do, to me or anyone else. That night, with a mixture of dread and determination, I resolved to leave, knowing full well what might await me for daring to reclaim my own life. The aftermath was even more intense than I had anticipated. The moment he realized I was serious about leaving, Michael's obsession with control morphed into a consuming desperation. He began calling incessantly, first at my home, then at work, as if he could claw his way back into my life through sheer persistence. Each ring was a reminder of his looming presence, each message a thinly veiled attempt to worm his way back under my skin. At first, he tried gentler tactics, pretending to be contrite, using endearing words I hadn't heard in months. But when I didn't respond, his messages became venomous, dripping with a resentment that left no doubt as to his anger. Then he started calling my workplace. My colleagues began to notice the calls, glancing at me with curious, sometimes pitying expressions as I struggled to maintain a semblance of normalcy. It wasn't long before I felt my privacy dissolving under his relentless efforts to reach me. I began to feel exposed, as though his reach extended far beyond the phone, spilling over into my daily life in a way I couldn't contain. Despite the intimidation, I held firm. The anger and the threats felt different now, less powerful and more hollow. I could see the desperation in his words, but they no longer had the power they once did. Each day, his control slipped further from his grasp, and though his efforts wore on me, I was determined not to give in. One day, as I was trying to settle into an evening alone, there was a knock at my door. My heart pounded, a primal part of me knowing even before I looked who it would be. Through the small window, I could see him, standing on my doorstep with a strained smile, his posture too stiff to be anything but forced. Michael's voice was soft as he called out, saying he wanted to talk, claiming he had something he wanted to give me as a farewell gift. He promised he just wanted a few minutes, one last goodbye to settle things peacefully. I hesitated, my instincts screaming for me to keep the door locked and ignore him. But then, an image of his anger flashed in my mind, a reminder of how unpredictable he could be if he didn't get what he wanted. Against my better judgment, I opened the door, stepping outside cautiously, hoping to keep this interaction brief and controlled. Michael appeared calm, even gentle, a stark contrast to the man I had been avoiding. He handed me a small box, wrapped with a bow, and began speaking in a soft, nostalgic tone, as if trying to lull me back into his grasp with memories of better times. I stood there, tense, willing myself not to react. But behind his smile, I sensed a pressure building, a concealed anger simmering just below the surface. As he spoke, he gestured to his car, suggesting that we sit and talk, just for a moment, where he could give me the gift in peace. His voice was so practiced, so carefully controlled that I hesitated, feeling caught between my instinct to flee and the tension of refusing him outright. Against every warning bell ringing in my mind, I moved toward his car, hoping that compliance might keep his temper at bay just long enough for him to leave. Once I was inside, he closed the door and sat beside me, maintaining that composed exterior. But when my phone buzzed with a quick message, I instinctively glanced at it, a small, unthinking gesture that would prove dangerous. Michael's gaze hardened, his composure cracking as his expression twisted into a look of raw anger. He demanded to know who had messaged me, his tone now sharp, accusing. Before I could respond, he leaned forward, snatching my phone from my hands and tossing it out the window with a swift, violent motion. Without warning, he jammed his foot on the accelerator, and the car lurched forward, hurtling down the street. I pleaded with him to stop, but he ignored me, his eyes fixed ahead, the car gaining speed as his anger transformed into something reckless, almost unhinged. I felt panic surge, each twist in the road magnifying my fear as the reality of the situation set in. I was trapped, alone with him, hurtling toward a destination I couldn't predict, knowing that any further pleas would likely push him closer to the edge. The car sped down the road, blurring past familiar sights that felt like they belonged to a world far removed from this horrifying moment. My pleas for him to slow down, to let me out, only seemed to fuel his anger. He laughed bitterly, making twisted remarks about how if he couldn't have me, then maybe no one should. His tone was chilling, a stark contrast to the calm facade he'd worn moments before. I felt a tightening in my chest as the reality of his words sank in. This wasn't a scare tactic. He truly intended to punish me for daring to leave. With each mile that passed, I felt more and more helpless. My phone lying discarded somewhere on the road, my connection to any chance of help severed. Michael's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he veered onto back roads, away from any potential witnesses. I tried to keep calm, searching desperately for some way to de-escalate the situation, to pull myself out of the danger that had now become unmistakably real. As he continued his reckless drive, he muttered about taking me to his friend Jose's place, somewhere he knew no one would question our arrival. I'd met Jose once before, and I knew enough about his loyalty to Michael to realize that he might aid him in whatever twisted plan he had in mind. Fear settled into a hollow ache in my chest as I grappled with the severity of my situation, knowing that if I didn't find a way to escape, the worst might come to pass. Desperation gave way to a sudden idea, a glimmer of hope wrapped in a careful deception. I took a steadying breath, quieting my panic, and leaned forward, gently placing a hand on his arm as though I hadn't been pleading with him to stop moments earlier. I told him I needed to talk, that I'd been reconsidering things, that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward for us. The words tasted bitter on my tongue, but I forced them out with as much sincerity as I could muster, hoping he'd believe me. The change in him was immediate. His grip on the wheel loosened slightly, and he glanced at me with a mix of suspicion and hope. He asked if I was serious, his voice quieter, almost vulnerable, as if he was grasping at a lifeline. I nodded, maintaining eye contact, letting him think that I was on the edge of a change of heart. I could see the flickers of doubt and anger fade as he began to believe in the lie I was feeding him. Slowly, he turned the car around, his speed decreasing as he processed my words, his focus now on the possibility that I might be willing to stay. I stayed silent, my pulse pounding in my ears as I fought to maintain my composure, knowing that any slip could send him back into his unpredictable rage. With each mile that brought us closer to home, I felt a sliver of hope emerge, tempered by the knowledge that I would only be safe once I was out of his car. When we finally pulled up to my house, I felt my entire body tense, prepared to act the moment the car stopped. Michael barely had time to cut the engine before I reached for the door handle, pushing it open with all the strength I could summon. He called after me, his voice tinged with confusion and hurt, but I didn't stop. I stepped out, feeling the ground beneath my feet like a lifeline as I hurried to put distance between us. I tossed the so-called farewell gift he'd handed me onto the driveway, a symbolic severing of any lingering connection he thought he had. Without looking back, I strode toward my front door, my hands shaking as I unlocked it and slipped inside. The moment the door clicked shut behind me, a wave of exhaustion and relief washed over me, tempered by the raw intensity of what I'd just escaped. Inside the quiet safety of my home, I felt the impact of his actions settle into my bones. I had narrowly evaded his grip, his control, and I knew that I couldn't live in fear any longer. Whatever steps I needed to take, I would take them. This was the last time I would ever allow him near me. I had survived his manipulations and his violence, and I was done living in his shadow. The next morning, the weight of what had happened drove me to action. I went to the authorities, determined to make it official. Filing a restraining order was no longer a matter of choice but a necessity, a means of reclaiming the sense of security he'd stolen from me. I recounted the events to the officers, the reckless drive, the threats, the terror he'd instilled with every controlling act. As I signed the paperwork, a part of me felt lighter, knowing I had taken a definitive step toward freedom. Years passed, and though Michael continued to haunt my thoughts, I moved forward, gradually rebuilding the confidence he'd worked so hard to erode. Then came news that he'd been arrested for serious crimes, far worse than anything I had endured. Hearing the conviction, knowing he was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, brought an unfamiliar sense of peace. The constant anxiety that he might return, that he might try to reclaim what he thought was his, finally faded. Knowing he was no longer a threat allowed me to breathe more freely, to reclaim my life with a new sense of strength. When we started dating, things felt perfect, almost like a new beginning for both of us. But it wasn't long before I realized that our relationship had a shadow in the form of his ex-girlfriend. She wasn't just a memory, she was a relentless, haunting presence. From the beginning, strange incidents began to weave themselves into our lives, each one a reminder that she was unwilling to let go. The first time I met his family, my nerves were high, but the visit went smoothly until we stepped outside and saw his car. The paint was scratched in long, deep lines, the kind that looked purposeful and angry. His neighbors had noticed someone outside by the car earlier, and when they described her, it matched his ex. She hadn't even bothered to be discreet, leaving her mark on our first real memory together, turning what should have been a milestone into a violation. We filed a report, but there was no proof, nothing concrete to stop her. The damage to his car was only the beginning. After the vandalism, her presence felt constant, lurking just out of sight. It wasn't long before the anonymous messages started showing up on my phone. Each one arrived with a venomous certainty, accusing my boyfriend of lies, cheating, and deception. She threw cruel words my way, suggesting that he was still involved with other women, hinting at infidelities that I knew were absurd. I didn't want to believe it was her, but the tone, the timing, it was all too calculated, as though she was deliberately planting doubt, hoping to tear us apart. The messages came in waves, timed for maximum impact. On my birthday, Thanksgiving, Christmas, I'd feel my phone buzz, a mix of anger and dread building before I even opened them. She seemed to know our special days, choosing them as the perfect moments to drive a wedge between us. But what she didn't know was that her attempts to divide us only made our bond stronger. I trusted him completely, and we became a united front against her relentless pursuit. Despite our resilience, the psychological toll was undeniable. Each message, each accusation wore at my nerves, casting shadows over moments meant to be filled with joy. I told myself I could endure it, that she would tire herself out eventually. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. We managed to settle into an uneasy routine, trying to ignore her looming presence and reclaim a sense of normalcy. When my boyfriend decided to return to his old job at a telephone company, we saw it as a fresh start, a way to move forward despite everything. But on his first day back, he made a disturbing discovery. She had been hired there. The shock and dread were immediate. This wasn't a coincidence. It felt like she was systematically dismantling every attempt we made to live our lives. Within hours, he knew he couldn't stay. The tension of being in the same building as her was too much to bear, the constant feeling of her eyes watching his every move. He resigned that very day, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of making him feel trapped. But leaving the job only seemed to escalate her anger, pushing her to new extremes. A few days later, she was waiting for him, hidden near an alley he passed every day on his way home. She came out of the shadows, brandishing a knife, her face contorted with fury. He managed to immobilize her, but not without a struggle. When the police arrived, they arrested her, and for a brief moment, we thought we might finally be free. After her arrest, a sliver of relief settled in. We hoped this would be the end of her relentless pursuit, that the law would finally protect us from her obsession. But she wasn't held for long. Her lawyers argued that she suffered from mental health issues, leading to her release on the condition that she stay in a mental health clinic. She was confined to treatment, and we tried to tell ourselves it was over, that her confinement was a turning point. For the months she spent in the clinic, we experienced a fragile peace. Slowly, we began to let our guard down, daring to believe that we could finally live without looking over our shoulders. But then came the day we feared. She was discharged, supposedly stable, and the old dread returned, more potent than ever. She soon found work at a location close to his home, making her presence an unspoken threat we couldn't avoid. It felt as though no matter where we went, she would be there, watching and waiting. We knew then that we could no longer live like this, in constant fear and anticipation of her next move. Her fixation had turned our lives into a nightmare, an unending cycle of tension and helplessness. Our options were few, but we saw only one path forward if we wanted any hope of escaping her grip. After careful planning, we decided to move, to put miles between us and her, to carve out a life where her shadow no longer loomed. We found a place in a nearby town, far enough to feel like a true escape, close enough to maintain our jobs and connections. Packing our lives into boxes felt surreal, like we were fleeing from a danger that might follow us. But the hope of a fresh start was stronger than the fear of what we left behind. We settled into our new home, and since then everything has settled down.